And we are recording. Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us on this new webinar that Toronto Agile Community is organizing, this time with Dave Nicolette. Thank you, Dave, for joining us. And yeah. So before we move on with everyone and the questions and discussions that we have planned, just quickly what's going on, the agenda. So quickly the welcome from the Toronto Agile Community team, introducing Dave. Then Dave will follow up with the presentations and questions. And then at the end, I'm gonna show some of the upcoming events of the Toronto Agile Community. Just quickly, housekeeping rules. I know that a lot of people are running from the offices or homes, wherever you are. So you are on mute to avoid any external audio interruptions. So in order for you to communicate with Dave, please use the question box that is provided on your little go-to menu, and we will read the questions from there, and I will bring those to Dave for discussion. If any technical issues, please try to log on or log off or try another browser. Sometimes it just happens that technical issues get on the way. Well, without further ado, I want to introduce to everyone that is here right now, Dave Nicolette. Dave is one of those guys that I enjoy very much following on Twitter. The comments and the tweets are always very to the point and interesting, and bring a lot of ways that make me think on, I did not look at that from that point of view. And has helped me sometimes. Dave, you don't know, but you have helped me sometimes question my thoughts. Dave brings a lot of experience and knowledge, and he has a very interesting sense of humor. You can read all the words there, but I'm bringing my personal connection here with Dave. The sense of humor is very unique, and the point of view is very unique. So the Software Development Metrics is one of the books that I keep hearing continuously people referring to, and bringing ideas that are there when they try to discuss about metrics within their teams or their organizations. So metrics is a hot topic, and especially in Toronto, in our community here, with a lot of organizations moving into Agile more and more, metrics becomes very quickly a hot topic. So I thought that Dave would be a very good person to involve and ask questions and see what can we do on your situations and where you are. So Dave, thank you, and I hope I did introduce you correctly. And I'm going to pass now the presentation to you.
Well, thank you for the very kind words. I've been told I have a unique sense of humor, but not always in a positive way.
It makes me think.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't have slides, so I'll just talk a little, and then we can get into whatever issues people are having or questions they have. I've observed that there's a couple of different types of people when it comes to metrics, and you may be one of them, and you may have seen some of them. One type is the one who just loves numbers, and they love to do formulas and calculations, and they end up trying to measure all kinds of things and analyze the numbers in all kinds of ways. The other sort of person is a minimalist who wants to measure whatever is useful and necessary, but nothing else. They don't want to overload their workday with a lot of metrics. I'm in the second category. I'm a minimalist about metrics. What prompted me to write a book about metrics was the fact that many managers and team leads that I encountered seemed to have no idea what they should measure or how to measure it or what to do with the information. It isn't because I love the numbers. It's just because I think it's a necessary thing. So with that said, I think there are a couple of reasons things in software delivery. One is to track how well the work is flowing. And the other is to measure the effect of process improvements. With the Agile approach, there's a lot of emphasis on continuous improvement. Well, how do we know whether a change is actually an improvement or not unless we measure something? So there's that point. Another basic point to make is I think that metrics are useful for three things. Just for information about how things are going. Also as a diagnostic tool to try and help us understand where problems are in our process. And finally, as a way to motivate behavior. What's tricky about that third one is it happens whether you want it to or not. And many times people influence behavior in a way they didn't mean to because of the measurements they're using. Because it's only natural for people to defend themselves against blame and so forth. So that happens a lot. So what should we measure when delivering software? I think that depends on what sort of process we're using. So I'm going to suggest there are four basic process models. One is linear. This is what people often call waterfall, but it's the basic idea that to deliver software, you follow a prescribed sequence of steps, and you follow them in order. And if you do everything correctly, useful software pops out at the end of it. The second model is iterative, in which we recognize that one pass through the requirements is probably not going to result in a good outcome. So we go through multiple times, one way or another. One of the early iterative models was called Spiral. And it really proposed doing a series of prototypes. It didn't propose delivering to the customer with each iteration. In more recent models, we're more interested in delivering incrementally as well. So a third model is time box. That's like iterative, but it has two specific characteristics beyond just an iterative model. One of them is that we deliver a potentially shippable solution increment in each iteration. And the other is that the iterations are a fixed length. There are other iterative models that don't have those characteristics. For instance, evolutionary project management, the Tom Gilb thing that they sometimes call EVO. It doesn't necessarily require fixed length iterations. And you remember RUP, Rational Unified Process. It's iterative, but it's not time boxed. You could have an analysis iteration and a bunch of design iterations, a couple of testing iterations. It doesn't have those rules like contemporary methods like Scrum, which are time boxed. And the fourth model is what I call continuous flow. And this doesn't have time box. Yeah?
Dave, quickly, people are asking, is the spreadsheet what they need to see, or are you showing something else? I believe it is the spreadsheet.
Okay, I'm showing the spreadsheet because I don't have any slides. This is not pertaining to what I'm saying right now.
Okay, okay.
So don't worry about it.
Okay.
It's not urgent to be looking at that. So the fourth model, continuous flow, this doesn't have time boxes. You do iterate over the requirements if you're building something new. But the basic idea there is just to do whatever is most important right now and get it done. So this influences metrics because different measurements are meaningful for these different process models. The other thing that makes metrics interesting here is nobody uses any one of these process models exactly. Whatever you're currently doing is probably a mixture of at least two of these. But it's probably mostly based on one of them, and that gives you some hints about what metrics are useful. So let's see, what would be a good thing to do next? Well, what's the purpose of metrics? To support decisions about how the work is flowing, make business decisions about when to quit, when you have enough value, for instance, and to help you understand if you're improving or not, or just changing. Okay, so for a linear process, we could look at the spreadsheet here. Let's see, let me look at it too. If I can click in the right place. All right. Well, I'm not clicking in the right place, but anyway, the scope completed to date, I don't know why it disappears, probably because of the webinar thing. Scope completed to date is a pretty common measurement if you're using a linear process, because you have the iron triangle locked down, for better or worse. You know how much work is supposed to be done by a given date. So you can track whether you are on plan or not. I know this isn't a particularly agile thing, but the truth is many organizations implement some kind of agile process without changing the underlying management model, and they really are still doing a traditional style delivery that's based on a linear thinking. So you may be tracking something that you call velocity, but it really boils down to scope completed to date, because that's what management can consume. So one of the points I make in the book is it's useful to measure what is really happening and not necessarily what you think is happening or what you wish were happening. We might be wishing that we are doing Scrum, but we're really doing a kind of a big waterfall. And unless we're measuring what we're really doing, we're not going to have accurate information about whether we're on track. We might have a burn down that looks okay, and then late in the process we still find out we were not on track at all. And it's because we're measuring what we wish we were doing instead of what we are doing. So the real processes really mix these, though there's a lot of mixing right now between time box and continuous flow. You've probably heard this term Scrum Ban, which just means there isn't really a model called Scrum Ban, but it's kind of a combination of Scrum with some Kanban elements added in. The most typical one to add in is WIP limits. So the process is a mix. You're trying to do some continuous flow kind of things, and you're doing some time box kind of things. There's also mixtures of Scrum plus waterfall. You hear these terms like Scrummerfall. And that's really just time boxing segments of the waterfall. So you're mixing elements of multiple models. When you do that, you have to pay attention to how the work really is flowing so that you can understand what to measure. So I hope that's making sense so far. Another factor that influences the choice of metrics is whether you're doing discrete projects or ongoing continuous support or development. So most of us do discrete projects when we're developing a new product, and many places now do ongoing continuous flow kind of work for support, although you can do both things without any projects. That depends on how management is structured. Okay, well, there's a whole bunch of introductory stuff there that I've just spewed out rapidly, and I'd really more interested in hearing what sort of issues you're having or what sort of questions you have, and see if we can come up with some practical answers, because I'm a minimalist about metrics and also a pragmatist about delivery. So okay. I would welcome questions right now.
Yes, we do have questions already. So from Chris, you haven't described measuring performance as one of the ways to use metrics. However, quite often, they are used in that way. Can you comment on the challenges of using metrics in this way? So measuring performance.
Okay. I'm going to guess what you mean by performance, and I'm going to answer it for two different meanings of the word performance. The first meaning of performance here is, what's the team's delivery performance? It's basically their delivery capacity. And I think metrics can be very useful for this. One that I like a lot is cycle time. It helps us understand how much work a team can get done in a given time interval, and it's applicable to any of these process models. So I think it's pretty useful and very simple to use. If you are using a time-boxed model properly, you can also use a very popular metric, velocity. But that really depends on you delivering a production-ready increment, really delivering one, at least one, in each sprint or each iteration. Otherwise, velocity isn't meaningful. So that has to be used with care, but it can also be a good one for measuring team performance. So the second meaning of performance sometimes is individual employee assessments, that kind of thing. How good is John and how good is Mary? I'm not a big fan of this. I think that there's a lot of articles out recently that say high-performing companies don't do that. They don't do performance management of individuals. There was one article that said a company, a large company, determined they were spending 1.8 million person hours per year just on people running around trying to satisfy their performance management numbers. And they decided it wasn't worth it, and so they discontinued that. So I'm not a big fan of tracking individual performance. I also think that it tends to cause competition and friction on collaborative teams, which defeats the purpose of contemporary methods like Kanban and Scrum and XP, because those are all really team-based. So
Dave,
the measure is the team rather than the person.
all right. Chris made a comment here and is looking at performance from the productivity point of view.
So that is individual performance?
Performance as productivity. So I'm guessing from the team level. Productivity of a team.
Yeah, that's how much stuff they produce.
Right.
So yeah, you can measure that. You can measure throughput, which is how many units of value the team gets through in a unit of time. The velocity is another indicator of productivity. I have to say, and maybe this is part of my, what Ardita calls unique perspective, I never look for productivity because it only means how much stuff you produce. It doesn't say anything about quality or value. So just cranking out a lot of stuff makes you productive, but it doesn't necessarily tell you anything about quality or value. So I'm not sure that just purely measuring productivity is even a useful thing to do. But yes, there are measurements you can use for that, because you can measure the quantity of output that the team produces or that an individual produces. I'm not sure if that's addressing Chris's underlying question, though.
I think I'll let Chris to respond to that. Meanwhile, I'm going to move on to a next question.
Okay.
People are lining up the questions here. How continuous integration fit into this process?
Okay, if we're only talking about measurement, continuous integration will affect the measurements in that it will tend to shorten your cycle time. The continuous integration, if it's introduced into a workflow that had been manual before, it will shorten the wait times in between steps. You won't have to have manual integration. You won't have as many merge conflicts and things like that, so it will save time in getting the code through the pipeline. So it doesn't there's not a direct measurement necessarily of just that, but it will affect your measurements. It'll increase your throughput. It will shorten your cycle time. And if you're doing velocity, it should increase your velocity as well. And you'll have fewer merge conflicts. Also, you probably will have fewer integration-related errors, fewer defects. So also less rework, fewer backflows in your process. So it should have a positive impact on your measurements.
Okay. Okay. I'll move on to the next one from Dimitri. When it comes to predictability and forecast, how do you manage iterative and linear types of work and thinking?
Okay. For forecasting, I favor the lean measurements, especially cycle time. Mean cycle time can help with forecasting. I can actually, if I can open this, look at the spreadsheet, every time I click on it, it disappears.
We can see it.
You can see it, but if I click on it, it goes away from me. Yeah, well, I'll talk then while I'm clicking or figuring this out. But if you capture your cycle time for each story or task or whatever you're tracking, you can come up with the mean cycle time for the team over a period of time. So if you're using a time-boxed process like Scrum, that can be the sprint. If you're using a continuous flow process, it's your development cadence, whatever that is. That's also going to be a steady pulse that's the same length. It's just that it isn't a time box. So you can collect historical data about the mean cycle time, and you're also collecting data about the variation in cycle time. Typically, a variation within one standard deviation is caused by your process. That's called common cause.
Ooh, you are breaking a little bit. Dave, we're having some technical issues. Your audio is breaking. Dave?
So if you make an improvement goal to reduce that variation, you're directly improving your predictability.
Okay. Dave, can you hear me? Dave?
I'm sorry?
Dave, can you hear me? Your audio is breaking. So maybe if you can repeat that again.
Oh,
we kind of lost you for a bit.
Okay. Does this sound better?
Yes.
Yes.
Still breaking. Okay, can you try again? Okay, you can hear us. Let's try if we can hear you again. Are you on mute? I think you are on mute, Dave. I think, yes, now you are on mute. Let's... Dave, are you saying something? Okay, you're back. You're back online. Okay, I can hear you typing, so you are back online, yes.
Okay, can you hear me speaking?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, well, what I was saying was for predictability, you can use cycle time for that. Collect historical data about your mean cycle time and the variation. Variation within a standard deviation is due to common cause variation, that is, problems with your process. So you can look for ways to streamline your process to reduce that variation, and that's directly improving predictability. Well, that's one way to do that. If you're using a time box process, you can do something very similar using velocity. So as long as you're forecasting based on recent historical performance, your forecast should be reasonably accurate. But you won't get accuracy and precision at the same time. The more you can reduce variation in the length of time it takes to complete things, then the more predictable your forecast will be. Well, at least they'll be less variable.
There is a follow-up on that. The question is it based on an assumption that the work items are similar, if not the same size?
Okay, just the measurement is not based on that assumption. But if the work items are of highly variable size, then you're going to have greater variation. So if you set as an improvement goal to reduce the variation, that's going to cause you to look for ways to normalize the size of the work items. So it kind of goes the other way around. It's not that you start with the assumption, but it's that the metrics might drive you to look for ways to normalize the size. If you're doing user stories, you may be able to split them, for instance. If you're just doing some kind of a generic task or work item, you could still kind of use a splitting approach, or you could break out different categories of work that tend to have different lengths and track the cycle times separately for those. So if you have some tasks that are normally long, you could track those separately and deal with the variation within that category as an improvement effort, and so on. Does that help?
I will wait for the answers. Thanks, that's my experience as well. Now I see what should not happen. Okay. Yes. I'll go with another question. It is actually two people that are asking around the same thing. So if productivity doesn't measure value delivered, how best to measure value delivered? And Emily that says, any suggestion on how to measure value?
Okay. Yeah, there's different ways to measure value. If you're using a traditional sort of linear process, you're going to have a lot of upfront design, and that's going to build, you're going to build up a work breakdown structure in which every work package has some definition of its value. So you can track the completion of those work packages and count, accumulate the value from them. So you'll know how much value you're delivering. If you're using a more contemporary process, a time box process or a continuous flow process, there's a very nice metric that Dan Rosthorn came up with several years ago. It's called earned business value. And the way that works is that the key stakeholders or product owner will assign a number, a relative value number, to each story. It's very much like, it's sort of like velocity, but it's not about the size, it's about the value. And then you can track that on a graph and see how much value the team has delivered. I found this to be very useful for adaptive projects like using Agile, because then the stakeholders can say, well, it looks like we've achieved enough value, let's stop this project. And how else would you ever have a project stopped early for a good reason? So I like that one, earn business value. So those are a couple of ways, depending on the process you're using, how you could measure value.
Okay, thank you. The other question is it possible, is it possible for us to see good examples of metrics? Right now we are seeing what should not happen. So show us the good stuff.
Okay, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. I don't think I've said what should not happen, so I'm not sure where that's coming from. Is that just in general you're seeing bad examples?
I'm gonna wait for the person that asked to confirm that. But meanwhile, is there any? I'm guessing the question here is around what are some good examples of metrics?
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm still having trouble understanding the question because metrics just show what's real. And so whether that's good or bad isn't.
Okay.
It's kind of
I got.
opinion, right? So I don't know.
Okay, I got more here. It says on the screen we are seeing scope completed to date.
Uh-huh.
I'm guessing the spreadsheet that was showing before was around that.
Yeah, that just happened to be the first tab. So yeah, you want to see? Well, let's see. Now that I've figured out how to click on this without losing track of it.
Okay.
Let me try to find some of these other things.
And if you want to share then the screen, because right now you are not sharing.
Yeah, that's enabling me to actually look at the.
Okay.
There's some conflict with GoToWebinar and this. I'm looking for the one I was just talking about. It's in here somewhere. Well, maybe it isn't. Well, I'll just skip that then. Let's say, let me see if this is a good one to show. I also have to make the screen the right size. Good examples, huh? Okay. Oops. Well, here's one about, show that. And I'm not sure exactly how this looks on your screen. It may not be too pretty. But
oh, we were seeing the graph and now we lost it.
Oh. Okay. See what I just did. Yeah, it went away. It went away when I maximized the screen.
Now I see. Now we see.
Okay. Anyway, here's a cycle time one. So we're just counting. This could be hours going up and down here. Can you see my cursor? Does that help?
Yes. Yes, we do.
And then just the number of hours per task. And you can see most of them fall close to the mean. So what we would be interested in here is, and one thing we're interested in is reducing this variation. Let me see if it'll let me scroll without losing track. Okay. So as you improve, then you see this variation get smaller. I hope that's a good example. It's a positive one anyway. And the ones that are outside the one standard deviation, those are generally like one-off problems. And you wouldn't count those in your forecast because it'll artificially inflate the variability of your forecast. You want your forecast to be based on the way your process works, which is more or less in this middle area. And then these may be one-time problems that may be worth addressing and may not be. But you don't want to be distracted by the occasional outlier. Okay, let's see if I can locate the tab that has, there's a lot of stuff in here. I can actually send you this if you want.
That would be great. I believe everyone would love that.
Yeah, there's a lot of examples. Here's the earned business value one. So what you're doing is you have the, I'm pointing at my screen as if you could see my hand. Well, anyway, so as the team progresses through these states, they're adding up these value points that have been assigned by the product owner to each story. And this goes along with a separate chart in the book that shows the breakdown of the stories. But at any rate, when you start tracking that, you see something like this. So you're delivering, in this case, you're delivering a pretty fair amount of value early on. It levels off a little, and you're going well again. What often happens is an S-shaped kind of a curve. And when you get to the top and it starts to level off, that's the point where your project sponsor might say, you know, I'm paying the same amount every week for this team, and from here on out, they're only delivering these low-value, kind of nice-to-have features. I'd rather that they move on to the next project. So the value of tracking this is that it gives the stakeholders information they can use to decide when to stop, when you've done enough. So I kind of like that one. You can't do that at all with traditional methods because they don't see anything until the end. So I kind of like that.
Okay. Okay. I can move on to the next question. It's from VJ. He says, a common problem that I came across the companies that I have worked for is that top management, so directors and VPs, ask for the velocity to be reported. As the velocity for a team is an internal metric, it will not make any sense to an outsider. Could you tell us on how sharing metrics to other outside of team would help the team and organization?
Okay. Yeah. Due to the popularity of Scrum, a lot of people have latched on to velocity as the metric. But as you have observed, it's not really meaningful outside of each team. And when management wants to roll up numbers to get an idea of how the organization is performing, they need to use metrics that are not dependent on the team, that are more kind of automatically normalized across teams. And that's where these lean metrics come in again. Metrics like throughput and cycle time, they're not as sensitive to the differences between teams. And it's kind of meaningful, a little more meaningful to roll them up. So I would suggest maybe you can recommend that they focus on a different metric than velocity for roll-up purposes. The second problem with that is when that happens, the teams start to game the numbers because they're afraid they're going to get punished if their velocity doesn't meet some standard. And once you do that, you've really defeated the purpose of velocity, and you're not getting an accurate observation of the team's performance. So it's best to use these measurements that are not dependent on the process and that are not different by team for roll-up. And the lean metrics are good for that.
And by lean metrics?
Throughput, cycle time, basically. You could use cycle efficiency. Most people don't bother with it. But really, that's it, just those two.
Okay. The next one is, again, what are some anti-patterns that you have seen that can have negative impacts on teams, and how can we avoid them? So you just talked about velocity, but maybe something else being reported.
Well, actually, velocity is the biggest offender there. And in the book, I have sections on anti-patterns for each of the metrics, and the section for anti-patterns on velocity is the biggest section.
So you're passionate about that, right?
I don't know. There goes my unique sense of humor again, I guess. I'm not really passionate about it. I'm passionate about it, but I'm not passionate about metrics. But the thing is, what I have observed is a lot of abuse around velocity, mostly stemming from managers or team leads trying to set targets for velocity. The metric becomes broken right away as soon as you set targets because it isn't something you aim for. It's just an observation, and you have to treat it that way or you're going to get screwed up. The other anti-pattern with it comes about as a side effect of mixing development work and support work in the same team. A lot of teams will try to set aside a certain percentage of their time to deal with support issues, but they can't predict those. And so the velocity goes all over the place, depending on what's going on with the support work. You may have seen that too. That's another anti-pattern with velocity, I think. And a lot of the others are stem from that. They're just different things that people do that come from assuming velocity is something you can determine in advance. You can just say, we will have a velocity of 30, whatever that means.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't really use it that way.
Mm-hmm. Any other anti-patterns that are outside of velocity?
Oh, well, yeah, there are for everything. I'm trying to recall what some of the stories are that I'm told in the book. But you can misuse any of these if you try to use it for a purpose other than it was intended. I don't know if this is really an anti-pattern, but with a traditional process when you're tracking percentage complete or you're using earned value management or something like that, when a team is not on track with the original plan, very often management wants them to get back on track with the plan. They have them work overtime and all this kind of stuff, instead of accepting the reality that the observed numbers reflect for them. They really need to adjust the plan, but they don't. They try to adjust the people. So that's a general management anti-pattern. But
So
that can apply to any of these. Oh, go ahead.
So the capacity, working based on capacity?
Yeah, well, that's really more a question of management thinking that their original plan is perfect. And if the team misses that, it's because they were stupid or lazy. So it's not really that the metrics are wrong, it's that the response to them is wrong. And that's generally what all these anti-patterns are, people not understanding what the metrics mean or what to do with them. And there are just so many variations, I don't even know where to begin, but there's a lot more things you can do wrong with these metrics than right.
Okay. We have 4 more questions lined up. So I'm going to go with one. What is the difference between measuring a project versus measuring a product? So what kind of metrics would be useful on product-based? The idea there is that when usually teams move from traditional way of working to agile, the reporting seems to stay the same into what do we measure. So the traffic lights, the red, green, yellow. But on a product mindset, when teams now are not delivering project-based but product-based, would that make sense, or what would need to change?
Yeah, that's a good observation. It really doesn't make sense. Red, yellow, green kind of suggests that you know what should happen and that what you think should happen is correct. So that goes back to what we were just talking about, that it's the expectations of management are not aligned with the methods that the teams are using. Because you don't necessarily know whether something should be red or yellow. It's just information, not necessarily right or wrong. But when you have a project, I think that the main distinguishing characteristic there is the budget. So you have a fixed timeline and you have a fixed budget. And you may also have a fixed list of features. So if you are not able to perform at a level that makes all of those things fit together, you're going to miss it. And that's what the red lights are for. But if you're focusing on developing the product, you don't have that at all. You're just focusing on what's the next high-value feature to deliver. So there's no red, yellow, green kind of concept. And what I've observed is that probably the single factor that inhibits agility in development is that they change everything except the budget cycle. So you have all these short planning horizons of 2 weeks or 1 week or whatever, or Scrum or Kanban or XP. But you still have an annual budget cycle. So you have a fixed amount of money already allocated. And if things change, you may not be able to adapt because you may not have enough funding. Or you may have funds locked up for your project that somebody else needs because of emergent things that happen, things they learn. So the organization's kind of locking itself down. So yeah, the main difference between the project and product approach on the ground, as far as I can tell, is the budgeting. They don't change the budget model to match the process model.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. I'll take another question. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about how to measure continuous improvement within a team, or how fast the team learns. How
Okay.
fast the team learns.
Yeah. How fast they learn, well, that's interesting. You can measure uh, process improvement because it's reflected in the performance metrics, like velocity and cycle time. You know you're improving your process if you're reducing the amount of time that a work item waits for somebody. That if you can improve flow, that's a process improvement. And you can measure that easily with cycle time.
Mm-hmm.
And if you break down cycle time by the different work states, you can tell if you're reducing the proportion of time that items wait. But an earlier question about continuous integration kind of is related. If you're integrating manually and you go to an automated integration process, you've reduced waiting. And so you've improved the process, and it's reflected in the metrics. Now, as far as people learning things, it's harder to measure that, but there's some indirect effects. I'm working with a client now in which team members are specialized such that a particular request comes from a particular stakeholder, and there's only one person on the team who can do that. So this causes a lot of delay because some people are busy, some are not busy, and as a whole, the team's performance is variable. So if you are in that situation and you start sharing knowledge, do mob programming or pair programming or some mechanism so that everybody can learn to do anything that the team needs, that really smooths things out. So there's less waiting, and that will be reflected in the metrics too, because it'll reduce cycle time and it'll reduce variability. So it could improve your velocity or your throughput, depending on what you're tracking. You'll see the effect in the metrics, but it's not a direct measurement of how fast people learn. It's more a measurement of the effect of their learning on the team's delivery capacity.
Okay. We are going to take two more questions because we're going to run out of time. So quickly, reducing mean value versus reducing variation. Which to focus first? What impact one or the others?
Okay. In general, without knowing the specific conditions that you're trying to deal with, in general, I would try to reduce variation first, because the variation indicates kind of an out-of-control process. The more variation there is, the less control there is on what people are doing and how they're doing it. So if you can get a handle on that and start to deliver consistently and predictably, the opportunities for reducing cycle time will become more apparent. All that variation tends to be like static or noise in the metrics that makes it harder to see where you could do some deeper improvement. So I would start with that. And as that gets smaller, you'll see opportunities to reduce the cycle time as well.
Okay. Okay. The next one is we're going to go back to business value. So earn business value sounds like story points. Is there other metrics which measure the actual outcome achieved? Example, outcome could be number of hits on a website, a likelihood to recommend. Would that not be more realistic?
That would be more realistic. The thing is, it's not something that you would necessarily be able to see while development is proceeding. It might be only after the product is delivered. So if you're delivering incrementally, something like an Amazon, there's very little delay between the time they make a change live and the time they can start seeing some impact, in terms of hits on the website. But a cautionary point about that is it takes a very large number of data points to be meaningful. If you're tracking something like hits on a website, it takes many, many thousands of data points. So if you are Amazon, you're going to get that data. Within a day, you'll know the impact of that change. But if it's more typical website that only gets a few dozen or a few hundred hits a month, it would take years to get that much data. So you're almost reduced to a subjective assessment. If you get a few more hits the next day, it doesn't necessarily mean that's a trend. It could just be an anomaly. So, yeah, there's pluses and minuses, but yes, in general, that is, you're measuring the actual outcome there, not an anticipated value. This earned business value thing is, what does the stakeholder think it's worth? Because they're not going to know until somebody actually pays for it, and by then it's too late for making decisions about the project.
Okay. And then one more question. What is a good way to compare business value across different stories? For example, some stories are customer-facing features, improvements that can help drive revenue, and while some can help improve the team's cycle time and throughput.
Yes. In my view, every story is driven by business value. That's not to say that it's always obvious or direct. But if you are, say you're going to do something to the database to make it more performant, well, you can't really show that to a customer. You can't do that in your sprint demo necessarily. Maybe you could work out a way to do it, but it's not an obvious direct value to the customer, but it enables the system to provide better service to the customer. So what you can do to determine the business value of that is kind of calculate what's the impact that you think that will have, and use that as the business value for tracking.
Mm-hmm. Okay. In the last 2 minutes, before we close, one more question around some of the not so easy to track metrics that people usually are challenged out there. How should we measure things like customer satisfaction or team health, team happiness?
Okay. Well, customer satisfaction is usually measured by this, I forget the name of it, but it's like a 1 to 10 scale. Would you recommend us?
Net promoter score?
Yes, that's it, net promoter score.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one. Or by a survey. And, there's not really a mechanical way to know if somebody's happy. It just kind of has to be asking them. And the other thing about team happiness, there's a couple of things. I think they're in the book. I don't think they're in the spreadsheet, though, because they're not really kind of chart things. There's a health and happiness kind of index you can do at a retro, where you make an axis, X and Y axis, and you have people write down on sticky notes how well they think the team delivered, and then how they feel. And you kind of chart that, X against Y. And you track that over several retros, and you see what the trends are, and you can see if there's a correlation between delivery and happiness or not, and you can talk about what that means, as a team. It's one way to do it. There's another thing called the emotion seismogram, which is what, on each day of the sprint, how did you feel? That kind of thing. And then there's the Nico calendar, where you have 3 smiley faces. There's a positive, a neutral, and a negative, and everybody puts that on the wall every day without any explanation. You don't ask people to talk about their inner feelings. They just put that up there. And you can see trends and compare that with some of the other metrics. In fact, I think I have an example of that, of using multiple metrics of different kinds to see what's going on. I know we're about out of time.
I see happiness somewhere there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not a very good picture. Where did that go? I think it's under patterns. Pattern something. Let's see where that went. Okay, so let's see. Here we have, well, this is hard to do in a few seconds. I know we're out of time. But different metrics kind of aligned by time. And I think there's not a Nico in that one. I'm sorry. But
Okay.
anyway, you can also align that Nico calendar with some of these things. If you're crashing every few iterations because of technical debt, you see this pattern in the team's happiness. It'll be good and bad and good and bad, and then it just levels out at neutral, like they're zombies, because they've kind of given up hope. So that's kind of interesting to see. I'm sorry I couldn't find it real quick just as we're running out of time.
That's okay, as long as you share that spreadsheet people are interested in, then maybe they can go
Yeah,
through that.
sure, I'll be glad to do that. I'll send it to you.
Wonderful. Yes, and I'll share it.
Okay.
Thank you, Dave. I'm sure there are more questions, but we're running out of time. So thank you for your insights. Thank you for your time and your knowledge and your experience on this. And for everyone, I wanted to share. Dave, can you give me access now quickly? I wanted to share. Okay. I'm gonna. Some of the upcoming events from the Toronto community. Just give me a sec. Screen sharing. Okay. So can you all see my screen now? So just quickly before everyone leaves, we want to hear your feedback. Not just on this webinar, that would be great, but even on other things around the Toronto Agile community. We are very excited to open now the registrations for the conference in November 14. You know, it's a conference that always is sold out, so you want to go and buy your ticket as quickly as possible. Doc Norton is going to be our keynote speaker, and we are very excited to have him there. So stay in touch with us, either follow us on Twitter or subscribe on our website. We're going to send, either by email or Twitter, we're going to send the recording of this session. And Dave, the spreadsheet that Dave will share with us. Dave, thank you very much once again. This was a very interesting webinar, and we are looking forward to hearing from you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.